Friends, it'd be great if you keep your Bibles open to that passage. One Sunday morning, Ross arrives for church. It's a beautiful day like today, and he was really looking forward to church. And as he arrived at church, he made his way towards the place where he sits every week. A place where he is seen by others, but it's also a place where he can see what's going on around him. And he arrives and he bows his head quietly for a few moments, just as he's seen his father do when his father brought him along to church as a young boy. You see, Ross takes his religion very, very seriously. He knew every book in the Bible, he knew where to find them. He knew what was coming up next in the church service. He knew all the songs that they sang, even the new ones to new tunes. He attended church since he was a young boy. And while he got teased at school a bit for going to church, he knew that it was simply the right thing for him to be doing. And unlike his peers, he lived a very different life. He didn't experiment with drugs. He did enjoy the odd glass of wine, but, he never got fall down drunk or anything like that. And he was a good worker too. He wasn't the sort of guy who would take a sickie on a Monday and enjoy a long weekend. Rather, he turned up to work on time every day. And he was going out with a young girl, and he made sure that he was going to guard her reputation rather than give her a reputation. They'd have conversations about global warming and sustainable logging. And instead of going out clubbing on Friday nights, you know what he did? He helped the under-13s soccer team, local soccer club. And then on Saturday afternoons, he was involved in a bush regeneration project in his local community. And as Ross was reflecting on his life for those few moments while his head was bowed, he was sort of feeling an inward personal satisfaction that all was well with the world. He was ready to join with the rest of the congregation in song and in prayer. But then he heard a noise from the side entry of the church. He turned slightly, and there from the corner of the eye, he saw a familiar figure from his high school days, making his way up to the back row of the church. It was Peter. What on earth is he doing at church? How could he possibly darken a place like this? And strangely enough, that's exactly what Peter was thinking at the same time. What am I doing here? How can I possibly show my face here? See, Peter hadn't been to church for years. And as he walked into the church building, he felt completely uncomfortable. He wasn't sure where he could sit for fear that he might sit in somebody else's spot and, be challenged by them. So he quietly makes his way up to the back, hoping that nobody will notice him, uncertain of what he should do with all the bits of paper that had been handed to him as he made his way in. And as he sat on the uncomfortable pew, he quietly looked around and he catches a glimpse of Ross glaring at him from the other side of the church. Now, you've probably guessed it that Peter had quite a bit of a reputation, even from his days in high school. If there was trouble in his unit block, well, then he was probably involved in it. And he didn't mind the odd joint from time to time, and he certainly didn't mind a few schooners at the local hotel. In fact, he knocked back a few beers just to try and gain enough courage to turn up to church that day. What on earth was he doing at church? Was it because his missus was fed up with him running the paycheck through the gaming machines at the local club? Or was it because she found him surfing the web for porn? It was both. It was neither. He felt deeply ashamed. He knew that he had stuffed things up well and good. And now he found himself sitting there in church, his head bowed. Guilt and shame brought a tear to his eye and a lump to his throat. And with his hands clenched, deep within his heart, he calls out, "Oh God, forgive me and help me." And on that day, Peter walked out of church right with God, and Ross didn't. Why? Well, look at what Jesus says. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. And the reason why I've told you this story is I actually think one of the greatest problems we have when we read the parables of Jesus today is that we've actually lost the shock value that they first had when Jesus told them. We sort of miss the hammer blows of this story as Jesus told it and the impact that it had on its original hearers. For you see, when we hear the word Pharisee, we think, oh, they're the bad guys, you know. And when we read tax collector, I don't know what you think about when you hear the word tax collector. When I think about the tax man, I think about a poor public servant sitting in a job in some office block somewhere dealing with people's tax returns. But you know what? In Jesus' day, these two people, they had a very different sort of reputation. In Jesus' day, the Pharisees were highly regarded. They were great men. They were upright, moral guardians of Israelite society. These men, they were very sincere in their religious devotion. You can't fault them on that. In fact, these men were patriots of Israel. They did not like seeing them being ruled by Rome at that time. And these were the sort of guys who gave generously to the poor and the needy. But in Jesus' day, the tax collector was nothing more than a traitor to his own people. They were the guys who were collaborating with the Roman enemy who occupied Israel in Jesus' day. These were the guys who made themselves rich by exploiting their own fellow countrymen in collecting their taxes. The tax collectors in Jesus, these were the guys who were beaten up when these men walked through the streets of Jerusalem. People would spit on the ground where they once walked. These guys were ignored, they were shunned, and they were objects of hatred. And what we have in this parable is both of these men going to the temple. Both of them came to pray to God that day, and both of them went home believing that they had prayed to God. But the surprise of this passage is that God only heard one of those prayers that day, and it was that of the tax collector. And it's given the shock value of this parable, of this story. I think there are vital lessons for all of us, including myself. And the first lesson I think that emerges from our passage today is to understand your need. To understand your need. Just listen to the Pharisee as he stands and prays in the temple. It says, the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. See, this Pharisee, he's a bit like a guy walking into a doctor's surgery and telling the doctor, I am in perfect health. There's not one thing wrong with me. In fact, this is the best I've felt for years. Now, what can a doctor do for somebody like that when they walk into a surgery like that? This picture-perfect specimen of humanity. Well, the doctor can't do anything, can they? If this person believes that there's no issue, a doctor can't do anything for them because they're not asking for any help. They don't need anything. And so they don't ask for anything. Maybe if they had have let the doctor examine them, then the doctor might have had a chance to see the raised dark mole on his back. Or maybe the doctor might have been able to take some blood and find that his cholesterol is sky high. But you see, this guy in the doctor's surgery, he doesn't need anything. So he doesn't get checked out. Earlier on in Luke's Gospel, there's an incident where the Pharisees actually asked Jesus' disciples, listen, why does Jesus always hang out with the wrong crowd? And Jesus' answer is, it is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And you see, the Pharisee in Jesus' parable here is the perfect example of Jesus' observation in those words there. You see, this Pharisee came to the temple and he was there to congratulate himself on his spiritual and moral health. He was not there to seek help because he had no need of it. And he wasn't there really to pray. When it says the Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, it's probably better to understand that a more literal translation of that is that he prayed to himself. Here, he wasn't praying to God as much as he was talking to himself. He was giving himself a big pat on the back for a life well lived. And he wanted that tax collector to know it. It would have been hard to believe that the tax collector didn't hear that so-called prayer of the Pharisee. And it's interesting that the tax collector in this parable, he isn't about to get upset by it. This tax collector, he's not about to eyeball the Pharisee and say, "Who the hell did you think you are to judge me?" Why? Well, it's because this tax collector was under no illusion about his spiritual condition before God. He was painfully aware of the darkness that lurked in his own soul. He is a man who knows his need, and he is a man who feels his need. He knew that before the one true holy God, he was in trouble. He knew his need. And instead of patting himself on the back for an okay life, instead of trying to make excuses for why he's done what he's done, he beats his breast and in deep distress he calls out to God, "God, have mercy on me, the sinner." Now, in your translations it says, "God, have mercy on me, a sinner." But again, a more literal translation is "the sinner." Because you see, at this moment, this tax collector felt like he was the only sinner in the world. And yet, that prayer that he prays is the one that God answers. And his prayer, it's not eloquent, is it? It's not impressive. It's not long-winded. But it is honest. He knows who he is, and he knows what he needs. So let me ask each of you here this morning, have you got to that point in your own life where you are all too aware of your desperate need for mercy before the one true God? Have you got to that point in your own life? Or are you okay? Do you feel as though like there's nothing really terribly that bad about my life, and nothing too wrong to be worried about? Friends, I think this is a really important question for us to consider, given the eternal destinies of these two men in our parable today. The second lesson is to not be fooled by our feelings of being okay. You see, for most people today, our emotional lives have become the barometer of how life is going. Most people today are using their feelings as a compass to sort of direct which way they're going to take in life, what they're going to do, what they're not going to do. If this thing makes me feel happy, then it must be okay. If this thing's making me feel sad, well, then I need to change my circumstances so that I can feel happy. But in this story, we have two men who are feeling very differently about life. And yet each of these men find themselves in very different situations. The tax collector, he does feel guilty. He does feel bad, and yet he's the one who goes home right with God. But the Pharisee, well, he feels innocent. He feels like he's okay before God, and yet he goes home condemned. And the question is, how could the Pharisee get to such a point that he thought that he was okay with God when he wasn't? Well, it was because that he thought it was all about being religious. In fact, I think he probably used his religion as a smokescreen for his guilt, that he fooled even himself. For him, I think religion might have been sort of a psychotherapy to get rid of his guilt feelings. And I think in this parable we can see that this Pharisee uses 3 techniques to deal with his guilt. The first technique is concentrating on all the things that he hasn't done in life. Listen to him in verse 11. He says, God, I thank you that I'm not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. So here, he's happy to identify the things that he has not done in his life. And because he's never robbed anyone, or because that he's never slept with anyone else's wife, he was neither a robber nor an adulterer. And I want to say that that's a good thing, isn't it? They are good things. We don't want people to act like that. But tragically, because he was always focusing on the things that he'd never done wrong in his life, he was actually blinded to the things that he had done. His religion was one that focused on all the don'ts of life rather than the do's. And of course, there are many people today who portray the Christian faith as a religion of do's and don'ts. Do this, don't do that. And they fail to affirm the good and the true of the Christian faith. They fail to show that Christianity as a life as it was meant to be lived and enjoyed. So that's the first thing that he did, concentrating on all the things that he hasn't done in life. Second technique to do away with feelings of guilt is to make your legalistic obedience the main thing in your religion. Listen to his claims in verse 12. He says, I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all that I get. So here the Pharisee gathers his evidence to make him feel as though he is okay with God. You know, in the Old Testament, God commands the Israelites only to fast once a week, but what does he do? He does it twice a week. And whereas the Old Testament commanded Israelites to give 1/10 of their income, he actually wants to make a point of, I give 1/10 of everything that I get. See, this bloke, he sees himself as going above and beyond his call of duty. But in the end, it is all a classic guilt avoidance technique. This guy is so preoccupied with the trivial details of his life so as to camouflage the secret sins that lurk deep within, that only he thought he knew about, or so he thought. But probably the most successful technique in dealing with feelings of guilt is comparing yourself to another person that you consider to be worse than you. I mean, this one never fails. It's a terrific technique if you want to try and avoid guilt. There's always somebody worse than you. And if you want to try and justify your actions, then just find somebody worse than you. Here is the Pharisee. He compares himself to the hated tax collector. You see, as he looks at that tax collector, he sees somebody who's pushing a truckload of shame and guilt that makes his sort of handbasket of 1 or 2 items seem like nothing compared to that tax collector. You know, we live in a culture now where guilt has ceased to be an acceptable part of human experience in the 21st century. We now live in a culture that is doing everything it can to try and minimise people's feelings of guilt. There are some people who have a disproportionate amount of guilt and anxiety in their life that far exceeds the situations that they find themselves in. And sometimes those people, they need to get some professional help in that regard. But there are far more people who often feel no guilt when they actually should feel guilty, because there is such a thing as real guilt. Today, guilt is seen as an emotional illness or a sort of a mental abnormality rather than an appropriate moral response to a personal sin. Today, when people feel guilty, they will go somewhere where they will not feel guilty. Some will go to a counsellor, some will go to a psychologist, some will come to church because their religion, like that of the Pharisee, has become the cure to feel okay And maybe you're here today and you know that you are prone to dealing with your feelings of guilt by concentrating on the things that you haven't done in life. You might have done these things, but I'm going to concentrate on the things that I haven't done to make you feel better. Or maybe you're focusing on religion in such a way that it's a great camouflage for your sin. Or maybe you've spent your time comparing yourself to others to sort of dull the feelings of guilt. Friends, that is the religion of the Pharisee, and it is dangerous because it fools us into ignoring our real need before our great God. And so here is the last lesson from our passage today that each and every one of us needs to hear, that we can ask God to deal with our sin. We can ask God to look after it. See, the Pharisee didn't think that he needed God to deal with his sin because he was okay. He's probably like most Australians. When it comes to things eternal, he'll be thinking, she'll be right. His self-manufactured ticket to heaven will be enough. He'll be able to approach the pearly gates with his self-respect intact. He'll be able to hold his head up high, knowing that he has done his best, especially when he compares himself to all those other people. And fail to realise that Jesus is actually telling this parable to shake people's lives. Remember what it said there in verse 9. To some who were confident in their own righteousness and looked down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable. I was reading this week one man's observation about what he regarded as the great irony of hell. A lot of people think that hell will be filled with people who are filled with shame and regret for the lives that they've lived. But this guy actually thinks, no, it won't be filled with people with shame and regret. It's actually going to be filled with people full of self-righteous indignation. There'll be so many people in hell who simply don't think that they deserve it. How dare God damn me, they'll say, after all that I've done. You see, it is impossible for any of us to get right with God without humility before God, without, in some sense, losing face before God, because it is only from there that we can call out to God for mercy and seek out God's remedy. And here in this parable, the tax collector, he isn't just hoping that God will be loving and compassionate towards him and find mercy. We need to remember, where did the tax collector go to pray? He went to the temple. The temple is the very place where Israelite priests would conduct sacrifices for the sins of the people. There in the temple, this tax collector could take hold of God's remedy for his sin and rebellion, because he knows that the priests are there making sacrifices. Blood is being shed to deal with the punishment that he deserved. For many people today, they think that it's very easy for God to forgive sin and rebellion. That all we need to do is just say, I'm sorry, and then God just forgets about it, and it's all done. But I want to say that people actually reinvented God into being like some benign grandfather, who, if you have a naughty grandchild, if the grandchild comes and says, oh, look, I'm sorry, Granddad, and then grandfather sort of pats you on the head and says, that's okay, off you go and play. That is not the God of the Bible. The God we worship is the creator and sustainer of the world, and as such, he is the moral governor of the universe. And he can't just sweep our sin under the carpet and pretend as though it doesn't really matter. If it did, he would no longer be a righteous God. If he did, he'd be open to moral inconsistency. And that's why there had to be a temple. That's why in the temple there was an altar. That's why there were sacrifices that were being made on that altar in the temple in Jerusalem. It reminded everybody just how serious sin and rebellion towards God is. A blood sacrifice on the altar taught the people about the penalty of their sin, that it deserved death. You You see, while forgiveness is freely offered in the Bible, it is never cheap. And here that tax collector, that man burdened by his own sin, laid claim to God's remedy for sin, the sacrifice in the temple. So let me ask you here this morning, have you come to that same place in your life where you have sought God's pardon and forgiveness as that tax collector did? Have you now given up on your trite defences for your sin? Given up on the illusion of moral respectability? Has that been smashed? Has the pretense of your self-righteousness gone? Have you looked to the sacrifice that is more nobler, more costly than any of the sacrifices that were ever conducted in the temple? Because when we look to the cross, there we see the great final sacrifice for the sins of the whole world, as Jesus lays down his life and sheds his blood, not only for your sins, but for the sins of the whole world. Have you asked for that mercy that you simply don't deserve? Because when you do ask for it, you can live with the same reassuring verdict of God that tax collector had that day, that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. So how are you going to leave this church building this morning? We'll all be walking out of here, I take it, at some stage. Will you leave like the Pharisee, with your self-respect intact? Will you still be able to hold your head up high, knowing that you've done your best, especially when you compare yourself to others? Or will you be like that tax collector, understanding your profound need for mercy from the one true God, that you are no longer fooled by your feelings of innocence, rather asking God that in his mercy, that he might indeed deal with your sin as well? Now, I know for many of you here this morning, you have already come to that place in your life as a tax collector has. And that every day that you live is lived in the light of these lessons from this passage. But there may be some of us here today, and you've heard this parable and you're feeling quite unsettled about what this parable is saying about your life. And if you're feeling unsettled, if that's true for you, can I tell you that is a good thing, not a bad thing? Please don't let that pass you by. See, now is the time where you can actually talk to God about it. And in a moment, I'd actually like to lead us in a prayer that picks up some of the challenges that we've found in this passage today, but more importantly, it is a prayer that will help mark that same moment in your life as what happened for that tax collector in that parable. I'm going to read the prayer that I want to pray, and if it gives voice to the sort of change that you want to make in your own life, then I'll then lead the prayer and read it line by line, and you'll be able to repeat it quietly in your own heart and mind and make that prayer your own. But here's what I'd like to lead us in prayer. It says, "Dear God, I'm sorry that I've ignored you and rejected you by living my life my way. Thank you for sending Jesus to die for me and to rescue me. Please have mercy on me, a sinner, and forgive me, and take over the running of my life, both now and forever. Amen." Now that's a prayer I'm going to lead us in prayer. If that is a prayer that you'd like to pray in your own heart and mind, then would you please do so? Let's pray. Dear God, I am sorry that I have ignored you and rejected you by living my life my way. Thank you for sending Jesus to die for me and to rescue me. Please have mercy on me, a sinner, and forgive me. and take over the running of my life, both now and forever. Amen. Now, friends, if you prayed that prayer for the first time, then that is fantastic news. And one of the ways that we can help you is if you let us know that you've prayed that prayer for the first time. And you might like to, you've got your service sheets there. Ez has been talking about that little tear-off section. Please fill out that, and if you want to, write on the back, just say, I prayed that prayer for the first time. We want to try and help you as a church here at St Luke's. And maybe you've got a friend that you've come with at St Luke's or somebody. Why don't you share that with them? I'm sure they'd love to hear that. But please know that if you prayed that prayer for the first time today, then as you walk out of this church today, hopefully over to morning tea, then you will walk out of this building as the tax collector walked out of that temple, that you'll be justified with God, that you'll know his forgiveness. Amen.